Good evening and welcome to the monthly ZWAC show of the Northern California Recycling Association. I am your host, John Moore. Each month, we try to feature one speaker who inspires us to do more for zero waste, which we then pair with related past stories from some of the pioneers of zero waste. Tonight, we revisit two themes. One, whether the world can be saved by compost, and the other is the spirituality that comes from working with, not against, Mother Earth. So the most famous poem about waste is T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, and it begins with the phrase, "April is the cruelest month." But many civilizations and religions in the world believe that April is a time to celebrate renewal and rebirth, the freedom from winter and oppression, a time to plant and a time to sow. So tonight on the ZWAC show, we celebrate two ideas. One is that practicing zero waste is a spiritual way to connect with the world, much as the wonder expressed by the late Will Bakx when he beheld in his hands the compost he himself had created. We will hear tonight several expressions from zero waste pioneers who felt that their work had a spiritual aspect. The second idea we celebrate tonight is that we might yet save the world from the worst of man-made climate change, and that one tool is both available to everyone and deserves to be championed by our leaders. We're thrilled tonight to be joined by Calla Rose Ostrander of the descriptively named Terra Regenerative Capital, who will reveal the wonders of carbon sequestration, a process that renews soil and removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. What could be better than that? Could we use this process more than we do? And if we can't, why not? And if something that promising can't reach its full potential, perhaps that is why April is the cruelest month, a time when the promise of needed change meets the reality of entropy. And with that, I lead into our Recycling Archives Director, Susan Kinsella, who took a sabbatical last month, but this month is back to share some readings from the Recycling Archives about spirituality. Susan, take it away.
Thank you. I'm going to share a screen here. So let me get that set up. Okay. And slideshow. Okay. So first I want to just tell you a little bit again about the Recycling Archives project. It was started back in 2007 when a couple of dozen people who had started many of the early recycling programs in the US got together to record each other talking about their recycling histories. And even today, there is very little history recorded about the recycling movement, even though it was unique in starting as a grassroots movement and then grew into a huge worldwide multinational industry, both for better and for worse. But we're still recording histories of leading recyclers, and the work feels even more urgent now, as many are getting older, we've already lost some of them, and there's just so many fabulous stories that we want to be collecting from lots of people still. This is a grassroots movement whose history we think is critical to collect and preserve because it has so many lessons for us today, in the present, and for the future going forward. Our interview conversations explore all kinds of memories and stories, depending on what kind of work the person we're interviewing did or is still doing in their recycling career. But eventually we cover most of a list of 22 consistent questions that are meaningful to most everybody. And one of those questions is, do you think there's a spiritual dimension to recycling? We thought it was especially relevant right now because many just celebrated Easter, and a few days before that was Passover, and we're still in the month of Ramadan. So in our interviews, it's really fascinating the kinds of answers that people so thoughtfully give. Some of them just flat out say no. Jay Wexler, who was an entrepreneurial metals trader and who died just a couple of months ago, said, "It's nothing spiritual. It's just that mankind will have to deal with recycling if he wants to exist on the planet. Otherwise, the planet will fill up with shit and he will not have any room. But I wouldn't call that spiritual. I would call it a physical necessity." Now, some connect the word spiritual to religious and have doubts about that. Mark Gorell, an architect who designed many creative and far-sighted plans, illustrations, and blueprints for recycling projects that are still groundbreaking today, spent many hours in deep conversations with his best friend, Dan Knapp. Dan had trained as a sociologist and had been a college sociology professor for many years before he started up Urban Ore in Berkeley. Sadly, at the time of these recordings, Mark was dying of cancer. So as part of those conversations, he told Dan, I don't mind learning what religions are all about, but when you join a religion, you're here and you can't go over there anymore. I see a lot of value in religion for a lot of people. Religion holds their lives together. That's really important to them, and that's fine. But I don't want to join to belong, and I don't like it if they say, hey, you got to be like us. Other than that, I think it's fine. And Dan answered him, do you ever listen to spirituals? Hymns and poetry set to music? People sing spiritual songs because they're oppressed. Spirituals are hopeful. They connect people to the great altogether. And Mark, because of the way you live and work, I think you're one of the most spiritual people I know. But if you don't want to be a spiritual person, go ahead and deny it. Fine. And Mark said, well, there's hundreds of people, various relatives, people I know, praying for me right now, And I don't know if prayers are useful or not, but I think they are nice. Mark's wife, Nancy Gorell, is a fabulous artist and illustrator who put much of her talent to use in making recycling concepts easier to understand through pictures. And she said, I went to Bible school. My aunt was superintendent of Sunday school. I still have a Bible given to me for perfect attendance for 1 year at Presbyterian Sunday school. I love those Bible stories. The teachings of Jesus are just lovely. I don't think he was Son of God or any of that stuff, though, maybe metaphorically. But I'm not an adherent of any particular religion. I am a person who feels connected to all of nature and the universe and everything in it. I call my belief the great altogether. It goes out to the farthest imaginable galaxy and even includes the black holes. We're part of all that. Although we die, we don't go away. We come from the universe, we return to it. And that's my religion right there. You try to maintain the beautiful creation we're given. You celebrate the beauty of creation as it exists. It just seems like a criminal activity to go against that precept. And art is appreciation of this beautiful creation. Art is gratitude. Rick Anthony, who developed the first recycling program in Fresno, California, and then expanded and developed programs for San Diego, is now encouraging and connecting zero waste programs all over the world. What he said about whether there is spirituality connected to recycling was, yeah, I think so. Terry Brown called it the Zen of recycling. I'm not quite that mystical, but the way I see it is that the biosphere is a collection of gases. And however it got there, it's the essence of life on this planet. What's good for the biosphere is good for everybody. And what's bad for the biosphere is bad for everybody. To me, that puts my value system on a solid foundation, and it's as close as I can get to God. Now, some people connected spirituality to how to be in the world in a larger sense. David Tam calls himself an environmental advocate, while he worked in several different recycling programs in Northern California. And he says, spiritual, in the sense of being inspired by the movement and its goals, yes. I feel good about not wasting because I have a gut feeling about the inequality of the world and the maldistribution of material support and opportunities for people to fulfill their human potential. It has to do with fairness and the allocation of limited resources. It's a feeling of social justice. It's respect for all beings. When Gretchen Brewer worked in Chicago, in one of the very earliest recycling projects in the whole United States, she helped elect the first Black mayor of Chicago by convincing him to build his election campaign around promising to start a citywide recycling program that would provide lots of good jobs. And she said, in answer to this question, I try to live the aspects of right livelihood and right mindfulness, trying to live in harmony with the earth. A line that I liked in a Buddhist economic essay is, roughly paraphrasing it, of course, since everywhere on Earth resources are limited, we need to find ways to not beat each other's throats for what's left. And that really hit home for me, like recycling works for peace. Warren Snow, who helped develop many of the innovative recycling programs in New Zealand, said, "Oh, yes, yes, I really think there's a spiritual dimension. That's what's driven me a lot of the time. The spiritual dimension is revealed to me when someone who's been causing a bit of a trouble on the streets of Kaitaia gets a supervisor role at the recycling center." Or I remember a young woman who successfully applied for a job at the Kaitaia recycling station, and no one else in her family had a job. In fact, hardly anyone on her street had a job. One day, she was offered a supervisor role with more responsibility, and she said she couldn't take the role. It was a matter of confidence. But a few days later, Doreen was carrying a little briefcase satchel she'd picked up from out of the recycling stream, and she said, "Yep, now I'm ready." And she thought about it and decided she was going to take the job as a supervisor, and now she had her briefcase. Whoa! If that isn't a spiritual dimension, what is spiritual? That kind of story keeps me going, even now. Now, some of the people that we interview connect spirituality more directly to nature. For example, Brenda Platt, who directs the Institute for Local Self-Reliance in Washington, D.C., and is a national leader in composting innovation, said, "I'm not a very spiritual person. I'm an atheist, a humanist, a secular person. I believe in human solutions to human problems. I don't believe in an omnipotent, all-seeing God. I do believe in natural forces. I believe we should just be doing what nature does best. There's no waste in natural systems. It's all closed-loop recycling. So recycling is very important for sustaining the planet because it closes that loop. Waste is just inefficiency. Whenever you find wasting, see if you can bring things closer to sustainability by decentralizing the economy. That would be a good outcome." Amy Perlmutter, who developed the early fundamentals of the city of San Francisco's innovative recycling program, said, "I have a spiritual connection to the planet. I think nature is so awesome, and I feel so connected to the natural world. So yes, there's a spiritual dimension to conserving resources and ending waste. To be able to reduce damage through resource conservation, to reduce resource extraction, there's a spiritual component to that." Ken Dunn, who helped heal devastated communities in Chicago's impoverished neighborhoods by developing farming projects on vacant lots as well as recycling collections, said, "Oh, absolutely yes. My emphasis comes from having lived in an agricultural community that had a spiritual connection to the planet and the plants and animals we live with and depend on. There was no distinction between taking care of the plants, the animals, the soil, the machines, and the community itself. Taking care of them all at once involves listening more than expressing yourself, finding out what the plant and the animal and even the machine needs before you emphasize what you need. Hearing what is happening before you ask a machine to do things it can't do if the problem persists. Conflicts can come up over questions like, well, do we take care of the jobs or the economy? So do we take care of the environment or industry? Well, when you think like a farmer, there's no tension between these different interests. They all depend on each other. Mike Anderson, who developed groundbreaking recycling programs in Sonoma County, including the creative Scrapture art installations, has a deep connection that he explains as, "For me, recycling is a spiritual calling. I look at the planet as one living organism. The Gaia is a living being that wraps around this earth like a blanket. We humans are part of the Gaia. We're not separate from it and not in charge of it. A lot of people talk about the Gaia, and I believe it's real. Every 65,000 years or so, an incoming chunk of rock comes in and terribly injures the Gaia. It causes a great deal of injury. The last one, really big one, 65 million years ago, killed off the dinosaurs. Another smaller one did a lot of damage 23 million years ago. I think that the Gaia has made a conscious effort to fast track we human beings as a species. The Gaia wants us to develop to the point that we can fend off these incoming threats from space. It wants us to use whatever means we can to stop these grievous injuries to the Gaia. But while we are being fast-tracked, we're also creating all this waste, all this crap that's piling up on top of our fresh water sources. In time, those wasteful processes that go with our technological mastery can stall, if not eliminate, the fast-tracking we need to be able to stop incomings in the future. I believe that we recyclers are people trying as best we can to clean up as much of the waste as we can. So that's my spiritual role. I'm here to protect the Gaia, to clean up all this crap so we can get to the point where the Gaia can be safe. And that's something I want to help with. Jerry Gillespie developed innovative composting and soil restoration projects in Australia, and Carolyn Brooks created delightful artistic illustrations and pamphlets to promote those programs. Jerry says, I remember being in a conference in France in 2012. One speaker from the United Nations said, every human household on the planet deserved the right to have a garbage bin. I thought that was bloody nonsense. So I rose to respond, and I said that in 1788, in the week before the first fleet arrived in Australia to invade the country, there was zero waste on the Australian continent. Aboriginal indigenous people returned everything to the soil. Manures, dead animal skins, bones, carcasses, everything went to a zero waste function. The indigenous economy was continually circular. By looking after self and family, protection of the environment is absolutely fundamental to survival. For most indigenous communities around the world, zero waste has a solid base in the way humans act and live. And Carolyn added, and I suppose the spiritual element is identifying ourselves as part of a much bigger thing. No matter what you think that much bigger thing is, indigenous societies understood that they were part of a web of life. They had great respect for every other living being and for all the inanimate parts of the world that have embedded spirit. I think we've become quite removed from that connection. And Jerry adds, I think it's arguable that if you don't have that perspective, you run counter to the natural flow of things on almost every single occasion. Will Bakx, who was an immensely creative composter devoted to rebuilding the soil, said so many profoundly spiritual things in his interview. This was one of my favorite things he said. His words stay with me even though we lost him a year and a half ago. You have to be connected. I think as a society, we have lost that connectivity. And that's really where environmentalism comes down to earth. It feels like we need to get reconnected. We are not just individuals where everything is taking care of us and what has gone wrong will fix itself. We need to feel connected with the root, the sources, the earth. I think that as a child, I had that connection as well. It means a shift in how we think and how we are. When I say, I think spirituality is part of why I create products that work, what I mean is that I live it when I make compost. I don't let it go until I feel like it has life in it. It feels like life in my hands. And that's the test, right? That's the end.
Thank you, Susan. That was a wonderfully curated compendium of wonderful spiritual views of our pioneers.
Beautifully done.
Yeah. A lot of really great words to be able to work from. It was really beautiful to read through everybody's interviews and find all of those different things that they'd said.
A lot of commonality in the themes too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I like that approach of taking one question and reading a whole bunch of people's answers.
Mm-hmm.
I like that.
So is zero waste a religion?
Yeah.
With
Well, No. Is a religion structured? Does it have dogma attached to it? Reduce, reuse, recycle. I guess that's our dogma.
I guess
That's entropy.
it's got a deity if you use Gaia.
But I
Waste-
don't think that
Waste
it's a
till it's
religion.
wasted.
Two people speaking. I don't.
I'm sorry, I said waste doesn't waste until it's wasted, as long as we're
Yeah.
coming with slogans.
But I don't think that it's a religion. I think that people develop their own connection to what really makes it so meaningful to them. And for a lot of people, it's connection to the earth. And evaluating, is this going to be good for the earth, is part of deciding, is this the direction we should go in, or is it the wrong direction?
One thing I was struck about hearing Mike's talk about the Gaia is, at least in Greek mythology, Gaia is pretty self-protective. If Gaia thinks she's being abused by the little ants that are down there populating her, she does something about it, and it's usually unpleasant. And one can say that's what she's doing to us right now.
One could say that. One could. One could say that we did it to ourselves. When I worked at Friends of the Earth on the newsletter Not Man Apart that came out twice a month, we were all very involved in environmentalism and figuring out, that was the 1970s, the environmental decade. And we were trying to figure out, what is the purest thing we can do? What are the things to do that most closely fit with the natural pattern and the way the natural world works? Or as Mike Anderson would say, how do we figure out how the Gaia works and we get in tune with that? It's the same thing. And we were accused one time of having a religious, spiritual feeling about it. And we said, well, yeah. We looked around at each other and said, here's the accusation. What do you think about that? And we said, yeah, well, that's right, And then the colors of green began to be invented. How green are you? And we figured we were deep green, and it was a nice color.
Well,
And when we found things that were in tune with how the natural world works, that was the path to be on.
well, you also
Never
worked
went wrong.
you worked for a very spiritual person, David Brower, right? Didn't
That's right. He called himself a fallen away Presbyterian. Yeah. Yeah, he was very spiritual, but it was all that same kind of spirituality where, and that's where the name of our newsletter came from, Not Man Apart. It's a Robinson Jeffers poem about love, the wholeness of the universe and life. Love that, not man apart from that. And it seemed to fit perfectly, to love the wholeness. You're also loving humans at the same time when you're loving the wholeness, but you're not loving humans. I don't see how you can separate from that, but
Right. Does anybody else have anything they want to add to the spirituality of zero waste? We're waiting for our speaker to arrive at 6 o'clock, which is about 4 minutes away. But if there are other things people would like to share, you're all in this business.
Reverend Boone, what do you think? Is it spiritual?
Arthur, is zero waste a religion? Got unmute.
Oh.
Yeah.
Unmute yourself, Arthur.
Arthur is an ordained minister. He's qualified to speak to this.
Yes, he is.
Earlier today, though, he said, I'm a 19th century guy trying to live in a 21st century world.
And you got to unmute yourself to be in the 20th century.
Yeah, you do.
21st, we're in the 21st now,
You did something to it, Arthur. It was starting to unmute and then it went back.
Arthur, right down at the bottom of left of your screen, there's a little microphone.
You got
Just
it.
put the cursor on that and squeeze your cursor and you'll be unmuted.
He is. Go ahead, Arthur.
Am I now unmuted?
There you are.
Yay,
Can everybody hear me?
yes.
Okay,
I'll show
So
you
tell us
my-
about spirituality.
okay,
I'll show
preacher
you
man,
my-
tell us what you have to say.
You're the
Yes.
only certified diploma spiritualist we have here.
I think I think everybody has a responsibility to live responsibly. And you have to be aware that we are a part of a community. The woman I lived with for 7 years before she died, about 8 years ago, she said that she hoped to be remembered as being plucky, competent, and loving. And in some ways, those are, I won't call those spiritual things, but I think it's very personal goals. And I thought she did that very well. It was a great pleasure to be with her when she was alive. And that's all. I find spiritual talk kind of hard to connect to. A lot of people going off in a lot of strange directions, and I've been always pretty simple and straightforward, I think. So I'm done. Not very helpful.
Thanks for sharing it, Arthur.
I was going to share. My name is Bart, and before my mother passed, she shared that she felt this biosphere was a connection of energy on all levels. It's organized, it's disciplined, and there's a purpose for it. And when you pass, even when you're living or decaying, there's an organization around that energy. And so I was of the belief that when we waste, when things, they still have energy, of course, but they go into a sink and they're not contributing to the biosphere. And but we can have ways of bringing that energy back into the biosphere. So it's a pretty interesting concept, and one that I could put my hat on. She's a great lady.
That's a nice concept.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Was she spiritually inclined all her life that way?
She was very. Well, she was born Anglican into an Anglican family, and then she deviated. She started writing and deviated away from religion to find into her own space. And some of the books that she wrote, some of the things she did were just absolutely fantastic. I've got manuscripts that haven't even been published, piled in a floor of the closet that I just enjoy reading.
Writers tend to have those.
Yeah, that's true. They mail them to themselves to get that protection, and then they never finish the book.
I'm trying to communicate with our speaker at the moment.
I was going to ask the question, has anybody been to a sermon or in any of the churches? How is recycling and waste being communicated to the congregations? We're sitting here as professionals talking about it. I'm just curious to know how it's reflected in the religious community.
Well,
That's a real good question. Once upon a time, also in the 70s, when I was being an environmentalist at the time, there was a book about stewardship for Christians, because Christians are, well, all of God's children, according to the book of Moses, all of God's children are charged with taking care of the planet, and the planet is given to our stewardship. And there was a book in the 70s about stewardship and Christianity and the value of it in Christianity. And recycling then would be part of the stewardship of the planet.
Well, and I'm not the scripture expert that I imagine Arthur is, but there is Jesus spoke at the Sermon of the Mount, and when he wasn't talking about loaves and fishes, he did say, "Let there be no waste." And I know that line because Mark Gagliardi used to like to quote that often, "Let there be no waste." So there's a strong Christian foundation for that idea.
Okay,
that
I'm going to get out my Bible here and I'm going to check that. That's interesting.
Be a great tagline for your company, right?
Yes.
When I was about 9 years old, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
I was about 9 years old. My mother said, "I want you to come down to the church with me. I'm putting on this church supper, and I need somebody to wash the dishes, and it's time for you to make yourself useful." Like I wasn't a little kid, and I had to be responsible. And I realized that I realized later when I went to a very prestigious college, but it never really kind of caught a hold of me. And the idea that I should be rich or powerful, that never really occurred to me. What did occur to me about 3 years ago is that what my mother said then, make yourself useful, has in fact been the guiding principle in my life, for whatever that's worth. Over.
Okay, Arthur, help me out here. Where is the Sermon on the Mount in
Where's
scriptures?
Matthew 5-7.
Okay.
I remember some things.
That's a good one to know.
Catching up on my back newspapers while we're talking to them. Is Brooms online?
He was.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah.
Yeah. Did you see what happens at First Friday? Or did it get canceled?
No, it went on. It was quite a few people out there considering. Nobody's wearing masks, of course, and
Right.
it's pretty congested.
Is Teresa still involved with that?
No, she turned it over to another group of folks.
Yeah. I've been disappointed generally in the program.
Well, it's still going on. You have a lot of participation, so it's still going strong.
What I would like to see is the city pays for the RG&O bins to be there by the garbage company. I don't know what they have to pay for that, but in my opinion, the government has nothing to say about what you do with your R and your O. They only have to say with what you do with your G. And your garbage, because your garbage has a civic obligation. It can create a human problem, whereas recycling and composting would not. Organics management. So I think that I think the city says the wrong thing by essentially paying for the garbage company to pay us to spend all this money to bring these 3 bins there, 6-yarders, and because it says it puts them as equal participants in the human activity of disposing of no longer wanted materials. But when I put stuff in the garbage, when I'm living by myself, I put out about a pound a week, maybe. Everything else goes into the G and the O. And I think most of the people who are on this conversation probably feel the same way. So I think you have to figure out how to encourage people. I live in a unit now with 12 apartments in it, and there's only 2 people who pay attention to the green bin, except when they're putting their pizza boxes in it. It's a sad situation. Over.
So we were hoping tonight to talk about carbon sequestration and compost, but our Our speaker hasn't arrived yet, and I don't feel particularly knowledgeable enough to talk about it myself. But if there's anybody else on this Zoom that would like to talk about carbon sequestration while we wait, it would be great. Otherwise,
Well, I recall a couple of years ago in the Sierra Club chapter Zero Waste Committee, there was a presentation by a couple of people from Marin County who were at the time doing what was still at that moment an experiment, which has since been concluded. But they got outstanding and unexpectedly excellent results they were attempting carbon sequestration. And Dan, help me out here. What were they doing? They were not, they were like letting cattle poop in the pastures and just leaving it.
Yeah,
And they were doing
regenerative
the natural thing.
it's called regenerative agriculture, I think.
Yeah, but what were the practices? They were basically leaving it in the ground. They were leaving everything on the ground, just where it normally would be. And it turns out to be amazingly constructive for sequestering carbon right where it's generated, which is in the soil.
I'd like to ask if Ruth Abbe is here. Are you still here, Ruth? Can you unmute? Ruth?
I am here.
Could we talk for a minute about Montgomery County, Maryland? You and I have been on a task force for about a year now. And let me just set this up a little bit. Montgomery County is a county that has over 1 million residents, and it's a fairly wealthy area. And they have a Covanta incinerator that burns 1,000 tons per day. They have decided as a county to close that incinerator. But then the question is, what do you do with all that stuff that's now going to the incinerator? Well, they have a 43-acre transfer station called Shady Grove. And I've flown around over it and seen a lot of pictures of it from a local activist whose name is Amy Marone. But I thought maybe Ruth might tell you. I think this is one of the most important things going on right now on the cutting edge of recycling, because all over the whole East Coast has a whole lot of incinerators that were built. We never built them here. We stopped them in California and Oregon and other places, but there they got built, and now they're 30 years old and older, and people are trying to close them down, and it's the same problem. So Ruth, how do you see this as a social problem as much as an engineering problem? I look at that 43-acre site and I think, oh my gosh, we could redo this so well. We'd have reuse first, we'd have recycling second, we'd have composting next, and wasting last. And we'd be generating way more money than it does now. And I know that it generates a lot of money now anyway. And we'd be taking care of that huge incoming supply of 1,000 vehicle loads per day of self-haul, all those kinds of things we could be doing. What do you think, Ruth?
Well, I think there's grassroots efforts like we are doing, and then there's kind of top-down directives like is required by state law. So one of the things that I found out really cool last week, I went to the Swanner Western Regional Symposium, and Zoe Heller was there from Cal Recycle, and she announced that California is going into a circular economy, zero waste, and they're about to embark on a zero waste plan. So that's great. Elements of what we would consider zero waste are in place: universal recycling, universal compost. So I had the opportunity to stand up at the meeting and say, oh, I'm so happy you're doing this. One of the things that we really need to see is resource recovery parks and a focus on reuse. And I pointed out that we were in Monterey County, and we have a great example there at the Last Chance Mercantile, which is at Regen, the Monterey Regional Waste Management District. And of course, also alluded to the salvaging program in Berkeley and the operation managed by Urban Ore. And she said, that's exactly some of the things that we need to be working on, because now that we have residential and commercial recycling and composting, the self-haul sector and the self-haul fraction and resource recovery parks are obviously something that we'll need to work on in California. So that was really exciting. That's exactly the same thing that needs to happen in Maryland. Maryland has some of the same laws that we would like to see, such as a requirement for composting for all large generators. But what they don't have, and it would be interesting to do a diagnostic, what they don't have in Maryland is they don't have any responsibility for local government or local organizations to take responsibility for managing the collection system for the generators. And so it's a little haphazard, you know, so there are folks that are willing to pick up your organics on their bicycle for $40 a month, but, you know, it's a little, you know, it's not universally adopted. So those are some of the things. New rules, as we say, in zero waste are needed. And you know, that would be the thing that I would say. And so here in California, obviously, we need some new rules around self-haul or reuse. So that's kind of the last bit of work that we need to do in California, both self-haul fraction and the construction debris, deconstruction area is the unmet need, I feel.
Thanks, Ruth.
I do happen to have, John, a few slides from the carbon, we have here in the Bay Area something called the Climate Emergency Mobilization Task Force. And so we're waiting for CALA. We have done a few meetings on carbon sequestration. So we could show some of those slides if you thought it might be useful.
Very great.
There are people here who know a lot more about it than I do, who are involved in carbon sequestration. But if it makes sense while we're working for CALA, here are a few, right? So in addition to San Francisco, and I see that Jack is here, some of the early innovators in carbon farming is what we call, is, you know, stop waste. And so here is a presentation by Trevor Probert. He also spoke at the recycling update last month on his work in carbon farming. This was from 2020. And essentially, Stop Waste is investing in carbon farming at their site in Alameda County, which was designated as a potential future landfill. And what we're finding in California is that all of our landfill sites that were at one time 50-year landfills with 50 years of capacity are now 100-year landfills with 100 years of capacity. And here in Alameda County, that is the case for us, since we have cut destructive disposal by half in Alameda County. We're no longer landfilling as much as we did 20 years ago. Our landfill is going to last for a really long time, probably upwards of 100 years or longer now. And so as long as we just have, you know, less and less and less to throw away, we can use those reserves, like the property that Stop Waste has out in the Altamont, for other projects. And so they have a carbon farming program for their 1,200-acre property. And they are working with the CDFA on their Healthy Soils program. And they've been working with UC Merced, measuring soil carbon sequestration and compost applied to 10 acres of that space so far. They also want to do this locally. We can do that in our own backyards. We can do carbon farming at home. And so some of Trevor's work is to encourage folks to work on regenerative agriculture right in our own backyard, and to, you know, using compost on our gardens. And he has an on-farm composting toolkit. This is at the Stop Waste site that shows how you can do mid-scale composting and also do residential carbon farming. Here we do an outreach here in Alameda, Oakland, Berkeley, etc. So some of the carbon farming practices that Trevor promotes for home gardeners, including applying compost and worm castings, applying mulch, plant perennials, planting cover crops, not to till. And that's an important thing, because if you till, all that good development of of the plants and the roots gets destroyed, and then maximizing biodiversity. And then here's their healthy soils guide to make carbon farming and soil health more visible in the foam garden. 8 detailed soil activities, so we can all do this at home. And then he reports to us about the regional carbon farming opportunities through Alameda County cities that include carbon sequestration in their climate action plans. And this has really been supported by SB 1383, which was passed in 2016, but is only really being implemented or noticed by jurisdictions really in the last couple of years. Not only do we have to reduce, edible food going to the landfill, we also have to recover that for human, for hungry people. We also need to, get organics out of the landfill, and also buy compost, because you're not really recycling until you're closing the loop. And then here are some stop waste resources on their healthy soils guide. Of course, you can get all this at the stopwaste.org website. And, they have an ongoing program on carbon sequestration, which of course is the some of the topic that Calla Rose was going to talk about today.
So while we're still waiting for it, since we have people that are knowledgeable on this, I want to throw out the question I really wanted to ask her, which is, this seems like a marvelous thing. You're renewing soil, you're making it productive, you're drawing carbon dioxide out of the air. What's not to like about this? And while these urban projects that Stop Waste is touting are great, I'm wondering why there's not some big industrial push to do this on an industrial scale. Take a big swath of non-arable land, and we certainly have lots of that in this country, and put compost on it. Draw carbon dioxide out of the air and show that you're doing something that's measurable. Why aren't we doing that, is what I want to know.
Money. Waste Management about 20 years ago said that they had investigated composting, and they decided not to go into it because they couldn't make enough profit at it. They required, any new business development was going to require a minimum of 15% profit. They're accustomed to contracts that provide 30 or 35% profit. They will go down as low as 15%. But 15% is a very high profit margin for most businesses. And it wasn't worth their while, because they could barely scrape past 10%, as I recall. And so there wasn't enough money in it for them. Now, there would be a lot of recyclers who would just love to have a 10% return, a 10% profit margin, but Waste Management needs a lot more. So when you're talking about a large scale, you're talking about a large company, and they want large profit margins.
I think circular economy, I was just going to say, with the circular economy concept, if you were working, you're generating this material locally, obviously you don't want to truck it or transport it great distances, because you're energy and going against the whole sustainability idea. But if you were to take a franchise agreement, a legislative rule that every franchise agreement needs to take back 80% of the organic material generated in your community and put it back in open spaces and public use or whatever, you eliminate the transportation, and you'd have to find a good home for a lot of that material, schoolyards and a variety of locations where they can use it.
So that makes me wonder, Mary Lou, I get the idea that it is Waste Management because there's not enough money in it for them, but they certainly have a fair amount of supply of the material that makes compost. So are they actively getting in the way of doing this?
I don't know the answer to that. It wouldn't surprise me, because you're taking a lot of the material that they want. When we were fighting the fights over who gets to define what garbage is and what recycling is, I remember being in the Sacramento hearing room with Ruth and with Kent Stoddard, who was VP for Waste Management, and there were a whole bunch of people in the room. And I asked Kent Stoddard, what is it to you? You know, if we, at that moment, this was like 25 years ago, at that moment, if recyclers take things out of your supply ahead of you, we're so small, it's not going to take everything. You're still going to have really a lot left. And he said, well, that's not really the point. We want it all. And we don't want you taking part of our stuff, because the better you get at it, the less there is for us. And we don't want dregs. We want the whole thing.
So going back to Calla, when you were talking about that, you saw a presentation about the Marin Carbon Project, which she and John Wick were the active participants in. You may have heard her speak. And you're right, it was a marvelously successful project that was done with scientific rigor.
Yeah.
And it was a success by everything that I've heard about. So why aren't there more of them? Why aren't they populating Northern California, since it worked in the Marin Headlands?
So they are. I'll give you the example of Zero Foodprint. So Zero Foodprint is an organization that's founded here locally by a chef, Anthony Mint. And he got interested in this because he's in the restaurant business, saw a lot of food waste, and saw an opportunity for regenerative agriculture and bringing food back to food and compost back in a circular way. And so one of the services that Zero Foodprint is providing to jurisdictions is to purchase compost and provide it to farmers and ranchers in California, specifically because of the requirements of SB 1383. SB 1383 requires that all jurisdictions purchase compost, and a lot of it ends up being quite a large amount of compost. And that compost that everyone is now purchasing, they may not have enough uses for it locally, or enough uses for it at their park and rec locations or at their city lands. So one opportunity that Zero Foodprint is doing is to procure the compost, and then on behalf of jurisdictions, and then put that on farmland and rangeland. And they're actively doing this. So Zero Foodprint is a local organization, 501c3, collaborating with state agencies and governments to actively apply compost to farmlands and rangelands in California. And it looks like in Colorado as well, to sequester carbon. And so this is some of their examples. Since January 2020, Zero Foodprint has awarded over $550,000 of value to 31 carbon farming projects on 5,000 acres, which is expected to remove 18,000 tons of CO2 from the atmosphere. 75% of their projects have involved compost application. So this is an example of their planner. I do also have an example of the planning tool that Calla has developed to help jurisdictions calculate how to get the carbon benefit from applying compost and purchasing compost on behalf of the jurisdiction, and then applying it to rangeland and farmland outside of their jurisdiction. So here's an example of what they're doing from their grant database. These are all of the farms that they're working with locally, and the amount of money that they are using to purchase through their grants to purchase compost to apply to rangelands locally. Here's some of the problems and solutions that Zero Foodprint is supporting, right? There's an unfunded mandate on behalf of jurisdictions to purchase compost as required by SB 1383, and their program helps those jurisdictions by providing a very useful co-benefit, which is not only to apply it to rangelands, but to sequester carbon. Here's some of their financial optimization and cost sharing. So they work directly with and really the barrier is not really garbage companies are not in the way. They are also having to support California jurisdictions to reduce waste and increase composting. Their barrier is that it costs money to purchase compost, and it costs money to apply it to farms. And the farmers they're competing with other things like chemical fertilizers that may be cheaper or may be subsidized. And so they are willing to pay the cost of applying the compost, but the cost of the compost has been a barrier. And that's where Zero Foodprint has been has intervened. And so you can see this is kind of a expectation of the drawdown benefit from applying compost to rangeland and farmland, drawing down the carbon, sequestering the carbon, and creating those healthy soils and reduce carbon.
Ruth,
Just want to
thanks.
intervene to answer your question.
That is very cool. And that does, I'm going to treat you as if you're standing in for Calla for the moment, because I had a couple of questions as you were presenting that. Since I have a family member that's a farmer with maybe 300 acres under cultivation, I wonder, do the farmers get the compost at a subsidized price, or are they paying full retail? And secondly, do we have enough, can we make enough compost to do this industrial scale sized idea?
Well, there's always more that is needed, right? So currently, the farmers need help, right? And that's why this Senate Bill 1383 requirement on jurisdictions to purchase compost, right? So we're all required. Every jurisdiction is tons and tons of compost that we have to purchase. And that has to be beneficially reused either on site in cities or at communities, or provided to farms and ranches for carbon sequestration. So here is a little bit of a presentation from Calla, right? Specifically to redesign municipal organic materials systems for climate and community resilience and equitable economic diversity. We worked with Calla a year and a half ago on a project for the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. And these are folks across the country who are interested in this subject matter. I was able to actually visit John Wick's ranch, which was awesome, when they were meeting with this Urban Sustainability Directors Network group, and got to see the actual ranch land that was used for the original Marin Carbon Project experiments. But spreading the word about why this is important was something that John Wick said he wasn't up for. He felt as though he had done enough, right? He had demonstrated it. He had gotten academics involved. He had gotten the state involved, and we have something called the Healthy Soils Initiative at the state level that encourages this carbon farming, right? Calla had previously worked for the state of California up until last year in supporting these healthy soils initiatives across the state. And but John was like, I'm outie, I've done enough. Now in order to spread the word further, we need to give this gift to others to make it happen. And the resource conservation districts that are in every county, so Alameda County, Contra Costa County, all the counties have these resource conservation districts. They have embraced this project, which is carbon farming, carbon sequestration. So one of the things that we worked on with Calla a year and a half ago was to develop this tool for municipalities to show them exactly what the benefit would be if you reduce organics to landfill and you create compost that you can then apply to farmlands and ranch lands. You can then make sure that this you can really create this huge economic and carbon benefit. These were the core cities that we worked with: Boulder, Cleveland, Fayetteville, in Arkansas, San Francisco, and San Luis Obispo. These were the keystone for all the soils, physical, chemical, biological, and processes. Water follows the carbon. Natural fertility or available nutrients increase where there is more carbon than water in the soil. This is how the science works. Here's the example. If you can have net carbon loss, or you can have net carbon gain by investing in the soil and growing grass. I recently looked up what John Wick defines himself. He defines himself as a grass farmer. That he's a grass rancher. That's what he farms. And then this was a process guide that was developed specifically as a framework to reduce flooding, drought, and fire, replenish water resources, restore fertility and human health. So this is just an overview of the tool that is available through the Urban Sustainability Network's directory. This is the process guide. You need to identify what are your organic materials, types, and volumes, identify how you're going to process it, how you're going to bring community stakeholders together, and identify the policies, plans, and contracts to get that organic material out of the landfill and into the compost, and then assess the application potential, and then actually sequester those materials. So, any other questions?
I'm so grateful for you stepping in to make that presentation, Ruth. Thank you so much.
Sure.
I do want to come back. Let's say I'm a farmer. I've got 300 acres. I'm in Sutter County. I know there's an RCD there. But my co-op says they're going to buy me fertilizers and stuff, and it'll cost less than they can do with the compost, and it'll work better. But I'm a young guy, and I really like the idea of the compost. I really like the idea of drawing carbon out of the atmosphere. How can I buy enough compost for my 300-acre planting?
Go to where it's being produced. And buy it.
So, you know, each of the jurisdictions in that county have to purchase compost, right? So they might not all be in compliance with state law, but there's just not a lot that jurisdictions can do with compost. There's only so much that we can give away. We have it here in Alameda County. We have these compost hubs where we're giving away as much compost as we can handle. But it may be that the urban counties need to contribute to those other counties to make sure that they get their allotment. I would put that farmer in touch with Zero Foodprint, Anthony, and say, can we get on the list to get an allocation of the compost you are purchasing?
So that's kind of interesting. So the government is actually setting the market by having this oversupply of compost.
That was the idea of the legislation, and it really came about, if you recall, from Bustamante bill back in the 1990s that basically said you could yard trimmings used as alternative daily cover at the landfill could be considered diversion, quote unquote. And it took us 20 years to overcome that bill and say, no, putting yard trimmings that are separately collected into the landfill is probably a bad idea. We got rid of that bill. And instead we have, Assembly Bill 1826, which requires commercial composting, and SB 1383, which really provides a lot of teeth to really reduce organics to landfill. So this is a big deal for us. It's working.
It goes back to incremental, John. You have to be patient and allow these markets to develop. They don't just develop overnight. One thing I'd like to say though is look to the maybe we could figure out how to get Will Bakx's interview out more, because it's an object lesson in how the politics of compost really works. He was put out of business. I think my own particular theory is he died of a disease, but he also died of a broken heart, I think. And it was because he was doing the most wonderful job of composting that I know of, and he got shoved out of business. And it was done in a bad way, and he was on his way back when he died. He had a vision of what he was going to do. It was absolutely new and untried what he was going to do, but I'm sure that because it was Will Bakx, it would have been a success.
Here's the front page of the Sutter County Resource Conservation District. I believe that's a load of compost. That
looks like a nice bunch of stuff. Yeah, that's about the color it ought to be when it's screened. And it's old, that's about a 10-to-1 reduction in volume right there from what it started out to be.
This is Timony Hood from EPA. I wanted to jump in with some thoughts. I'm just super thankful for the work that folks in California have done to get the work started and the research in place on this soil carbon sequestration with the compost. And I feel like it's just taking hold. So California has funded a lot of additional research, and now the USDA has been funding for several years some more grants to develop research and really kind of make sure that they have a broad base of scientific data that they can point to, that, you know, because it's complicated, right? With moisture and this and that. And so they're testing all sorts of things. And I feel like with that additional data and federal and state data to pull together, that we're going to see potentially a lot of investment, because there's so much new money coming in for climate protection. So I think that that's the jumpstart, you know, that's needed, is kind of connecting this all together. And I put into the chat a couple of open opportunities. One is related to USDA, where they're specifically funding composting pilots. And then the one that I'm really excited about, there's a climate pollution reduction grants, $5 billion from the EPA. And they're funding first local governments, big local governments, the 60 some largest in the country, and every state and territory and tribes, to develop either expanded or new, if they don't have one, climate action plans. And they specifically call out that one of the things the plan should include is materials management and waste. And so food waste and organics is the most obvious opportunity, right? Because of the emissions. And so I'm just super hopeful if people get it into the plan in this first round of planning grants, then those become eligible for the big money, which is implementation grants to local government. And that's where you could get, you know, lots of money going into composting facilities and equipment, kind of paralleling, hopefully, or even greater than what the state's been doing. So I'm very excited to see those opportunities, and I think there'll be more to come, because there's no doubt that there's a connection. And then on the flip side, I guess I would also say that in the kind of research I've been seeing, there are concerns that are sometimes appropriate, that there can be contamination of compost with PFAS, with pesticides, and sometimes with plastics, right? That we would reapply to the soil that would continue to contaminate things further. So I think that's another thing the industry just needs to be very cautious and have appropriate testing in place to make sure that that doesn't happen. So thanks a lot. I really enjoyed listening in tonight.
But it does go back to source separation. It goes back to keeping everything clean all the way through from start to finish. You got to do it, or else you have bad compost.
So Ruth, I had one other question, if you're going to stand in for Calla.
Okay, and I had one other presentation. I know that Jack had to leave, but I do have a good story to tell from Kevin Drew in San Francisco.
Okay, let me ask my question, then I'd like to hear it. Calla's the new company that she's with is called Terra Regenerative Capital, which sounds to me like a description of an equity funding mechanism to invest in companies that are regenerating the earth. Is that what she's doing? Do you know?
Yeah, well, Calla is close to folks that have money, right? So a lot of folks, there are a lot of people that have a lot of money that want to save the earth, right? And they just don't know how to do it. You know, a lot of tech bros and others, and, you know, people that have a lot of money. So she is working to advise funders on projects in a regenerative agriculture. What better to spend their money on something like this, right? So yeah, I believe that she is working specifically to direct funders to projects to basically save the planet. Yay. Good for Calla. The quick Kevin Drew, since Jack had to leave, story is that, you know, San Francisco has been really working on this for over 20 years. And as I was reminded by, you know, Dan, that it all starts with a really good source separation. Right now, if Arthur is still here, he and I are working in Alameda on his 20-unit apartment building where folks are not separating their organics properly. But if they would, and if they did, we have a really good opportunity to do something good with their stuff rather than having it go to the landfill. So, you know, in San Francisco, they have been working on this for a really long time. Their source reduction and recycling element from 1990 identified source separated organics as a primary strategy for reaching 50%. And that's because in San Francisco, unlike a lot of communities, they don't have a lot of leaf drop or yard trimmings. And so what they really needed to do in San Francisco, and this is how they were an innovator, was to focus on organics and food scraps and diverting that from landfill. And so the 3-bin system that started in 1999 and became mandatory before it was cool, right? In 2009, it's now mandatory. This is now mandatory. So the complex that Robin lives in is out of compliance with the mandatory requirement to separate organics. It's now mandatory, but here it is. It's taken this long. So, but San Francisco, just to give them a few props, has been a real innovator and focusing on source separated organics and recognizing that it's a closed loop system. And, you know, we have a lot of problems with garbage companies, of course, for various reasons, because of course they're bottom line driven, but Recology had been a really good partner with San Francisco over the years. And one of the things that they had done is sell their compost to the wineries and the farms in Napa and Sonoma and elsewhere, where the restaurants in San Francisco would buy the wine and buy the produce that then came back to the San Francisco restaurants in a closed loop. So that was something that was really important to do. Of course, they produce wonderful compost. They have, you know, they produced over 1 million tons of organics recovered since, you know, wow. And then from food scraps to soil soother, he says. And then, of course, you know, in reference to the Marin Carbon Project, before Callow worked with John Wick on the Marin Carbon Project, she worked in San Francisco for, I think, about 6 or 7 years, where she was one of the folks that worked on climate and then hit upon this carbon sequestration as a solution, a partial solution for San Francisco's goals, right? In reducing impacts of carbon. If folks haven't seen this slide, it's a cool one. This is John Wick's ranch, and you can see that the cows are gravitating to the portions of the ranch land where compost has been applied in a 1/4 inch. And, you know, I read something recently, he did this one time, you know, 8 years ago, and it's still very lush land, a 1/4 inch of compost. If we just put a 1/4 inch of compost across the whole planet, think what we could do. And of course, you know, the linear cycles, and then, you know, California's black gold. And then I just wanted to show this slide, which was the potential, the huge potential for rangeland soils to heal our climate. He's just showing you here, you know, all of the places across the globe where application of compost is really needed to sequester. This is that same graph that Anthony developed that we're now all thinking is really good, to just show how we can really just make a very small investment, purchase compost, and then help save the planet. And then here is why we want to do it. And of course, you know how to get in touch with Kevin. He's still working for the city from Brazil.
Thank you, Ruth. So we're sorry we didn't have Calla. This is our 25th ZWAC show. This is the first time our featured speaker hasn't appeared, but 1 out of 25 is not terrible odds. But Ruth stood in, and I think that we covered kind of what carbon sequestration is, the inspiration of it, maybe even the spirituality of it. And we've talked about a little about, you know, why that huge area in the globe is not being covered with a 1/4 inch of compost. And maybe it's one acre at a time, as Dan would suggest. So is there anything else anybody wants to?
I'd suggest a lot more, John.
Okay.
A lot more.
Anything anybody else wants to talk about carbon sequestration? Marilu, you're muted.
Well, but I do really think that
Sorry.
a local approach is really one of the best, because, you don't, as somebody earlier said, compost, you want to make the compost close to where it's used. You don't want to be trucking it all over the place, because then you're using fossil fuels, or maybe now you'd be using solar energy because you'd have an electric truck, but still, it's really good to use it where it's produced. And Will Bakx believed in that. He thought that every area has its own biome. It's a, and the biome is all the critters that live in that soil, and they're unique to that area. And the profile of what they are is unique to that area. That's what he believed. And so every single locality has its own biome. And that's really what Will was all about.
So then Will would look at that map that Ruth showed us a minute ago and showed us all the non-arable land in the world. For example, most of the continent of Australia.
Oh, yeah.
And Will would say, don't cover all that area with 1/4 of an inch of compost, because you'll be ruining the biodiversity of those areas.
Well, you don't have to do that. I mean, really, we don't have to do the whole earth at all. We don't need to, and it's not even possible. So let's just do what needs to be done, which is the parts that are being used as pasture and all that now. And we'll be able to, soak up a whole lot of carbon out of the atmosphere and put it into the soil. And it will also, another thing that it does is it retains water. It retains water. And so when water falls on it, it soaks it up like a sponge, and then it releases it slowly. So you're also retaining water, and there's just that slide of the cows going around and finding that the stuff tastes better where compost has been used, I think is a very telling slide. That Ruth was right to call that one out as a very cool slide, because it shows that the animals that are depending on that pasture land understand with their mouths and their gullets why they should be eating on that part that had 1/4 inch of compost put on it 8 years ago, and it's still doing it.
So I have a different point to bring up about.
I'm sorry.
I have a different point to bring up about water, and that is the question of salination, because there are so many areas in the country and in the world that are becoming more saline. For example, the Central Valley of California, there's a lot of salination going on, and it's desertification that's happening. So I'm wondering if the water retention in the soil would prevent the soil from becoming more saline. As in the Central Valley, it's happening. My understanding is farmers are applying pesticides and fertilizers, and then they water the land, and then the water that percolates down is more saline. And then over time, the soil becomes more saline. It's difficult to grow things, and the desert expands a little bit along the margins where this kind of stuff is happening. So I wonder if anybody knows, Ruth, maybe you would know the most. Do you know anything about how applying the compost and retaining the moisture in the soil? Do you know if anybody's measured the salination effect?
I don't know that particular issue, but there is a lot of academic interest in this subject. And so Wendy Silver, who is the professor at UC Berkeley, who worked with John Wick and Calla on the Marine Carbons Project, would be a good resource. I'm sure she has published in this area, the Silver Lab. We were recently in Boston University. There's a lot of interest in the soil scientists there as well. So I would imagine that's been pretty significantly studied. Wendy Silver is the Silver Lab in UC Berkeley.
Thanks.
Well, that was a very inspiring presentation about trying to save the planet. So thank you again, Ruth. I think that'll be it for tonight's show. Next month, we will have something new and interesting. We're hoping to have a speaker talk about the next wave of kitchen garbage cans. But that should be interesting. So thanks all for joining us. Second Tuesday of every month, 5 o'clock. We'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Bye-bye, thanks.